coastal town of Great Yarmouth, Norfolk, was bustling with people on Friday, the 2nd of May, 1845. The fine spring evening weather mixed with the arrival of Nelson the Clown, a performer from the famous William Cook Circus, who had arrived in the town with an act. He was attempting to travel down the river from Haven Bridge at Hall Quay to the Suspension Bridge at North Quay, while in a barrel or possibly a bathtub being pulled along by 4 geese. The news of this rather unusual attraction had spread far and wide. The trains coming from Norwich were packed, and the suspension bridge that marked the finish line was particularly busy, crammed with 300 to 400 people, including many children, all eager to get a view of the river. Soon Nelson and his geese came into view, leading to everyone rushing to the south side of the bridge to get the best view they could. All of a sudden, there was a sickening creak, a shudder, and a snap, and the bridge and all those on it plummeted into the water below, the screams of delight instantly turning to those of terror. The bridge itself had stood in Great Yarmouth for almost 20 years. Until its completion, the only way to cross the River Bure as it fed into Great Yarmouth was by ferry, but this was fast becoming inconvenient for all involved. Being stationed near a pub, the ferryman was often found drunk. So after campaigning, an Act of Parliament was passed in 1827 for a bridge to connect the town to the marshlands on the other side. The money for the construction was put forward by the Coy family, on the condition that they would be paid back by the tolls collected when it was in operation. The bridge was designed by Joseph John Scholes, a man most well known for his designs of Catholic churches across the country, from St Francis Xavier in Liverpool to St David's Cathedral in Cardiff, the Church of the Immaculate Conception on Farm Street in London, and closer to home for us, St Mary's Church in Great Yarmouth. The design he came up with was the suspension bridge, supported by 2 towers, and was to have a span of 63 feet across the river. Construction took place over 1828, including many local trades working on it. When it was finished, it stood 14 foot 9 inches wide, with a lane in the middle for a single carriage to travel and a walkway either side for pedestrians. It is here that the first problem with this bridge raised its head. It was decided on site that the original planned 63 feet long was not going to be sufficient, and it was extended to 86 feet, without informing the designer or altering anything else on the structure. In fact, Scholes himself never even visited the site of the bridge until its grand opening on the 23rd of April, 1829. He had relied totally on local contractors and surveyors to oversee his work. The bridge would not be open very long before it was temporarily closed for more expansion work to be carried out, once again without informing the designer. Its width was expanded to now allow 2 carriages to pass simultaneously, a much needed feature as the bridge had grown considerably busier. Now, the road from Acle to Great Yarmouth had been routed across it in 1832, but once again it was a decision that would weaken the overall structure. Back on the day of the collapse, it was approaching 5 p.m, the time that Nelson the Clown was to begin his journey, or illusion, should I say, achieved by a hidden underwater line attached to a rowing boat that would be up ahead of him, as of course there is no way 4 geese would be able to pull a bathtub along a river. The beginning of the failure of the bridge had been noticed by some of the 300 plus people on it. Their attention had been drawn away from the river upwards towards one of the main eye bars that held the bridge up as it snapped. But sadly, no real action was taken to try and get people off. The full weight of the bridge would be held up by the remaining eye bar on the other side for around 5 minutes before it gave way. In the bridge's final moments, yelling was heard of people trying to move the crowd from the doomed bridge, but very few listened. The south side of the bridge fell, but the north remained attached, effectively dumping almost everybody into the rushing water of the flood tide of the river. As you would expect from such an event, the front row was made up of mostly children, who found themselves trapped between the submerged safety railing in front of them and the crowd behind that had fallen on them, with several of them standing no chance of survival. With how they had been standing before the fall, they were now entangled in the railings. The scene in the water was one of total panic, with people trying to climb back onto the bridge. Those who could, attempting to swim to the river banks or to the boats that were quickly coming to the rescue. One young child was almost swept away to certain death, only saved by her mother, who gripped her in her teeth as she swam to safety. Another of the truly miraculous stories of that day was of a man who fell into the waters, landing on a submerged section of ironwork, with only his head just above the water. Despite the shock, and I can only imagine the pain of landing in such a way, he had the presence of mind to grab 3 children who were struggling in the water, keeping them from slipping under. All 4 of them were saved. The thousands who had come to watch the antics of a clown were now witnessing one of the town's darkest moments. But, as with all moments of crisis, it didn't take long for help to pour in. Whether it was pulling people from the water who were now too weak to pull themselves to safety, all the boats heading out to help. Everyone was doing what they could. The injured, pulled from the cold water, were taken to nearby pubs. Vauxhall Gardens, most famously, were a group of 27 girls. Some of the first rescued were taken to be cared for while their families were looked for, and even private houses were used. Blankets were provided by the Union Hotel, and the Laken's Brewery supplied as much hot water as was needed for baths to try and help the people who were beginning to suffer from hypothermia, while others ran around the town, gathering every doctor, nurse, and medical professional they knew to bring them to where they were needed, because, as well as those suffering from the cold and shock, there was countless cuts, concussions, and several broken bones. And of course, all the time, on top of this, mixing with this huge crowd, were those hunting for their family and friends who had been lost in the chaos. For many, answers and relief would come, but for others there would be no such luck. By late evening, the full horror of the day had been established. 75 bodies had been recovered from the river and were laid out in the Norwich Arms Inn that at one time held 53 bodies, the Admiral Collingwood, and the Swan public houses. Others remained trapped and unmovable due to the bridge. In total, 79 people lost their lives that day. 59 of them were children, with most being under the age of 13. The youngest victims of the tragedy, named Mary Ann Lake and Charlie Dye, were just 2 years old, while the eldest, Mary Ann Ditcham, was 64. More trauma was placed on the grieving families by many of the boatmen who had helped retrieve these bodies. They had not been doing it out of the kindness of their hearts and expected to be paid for their work, refusing to unload the bodies of their loved ones until they had been. The disaster struck the heart of the town hard, with the Norwich Mercury reporting on it 8 days later. In every street are to be seen one or more bodies, extended on biers, returning to that home from which but a short time before they had passed in health and life. The consternation and agony of the town is not to be described. It is as if some punishment was felt to have fallen upon its inhabitants. Every face is horror-stricken, every eye is dim. Many of those who died were from the poorest families of the town, and due to this, there was little respect shown to the dead. The families were expected to take the bodies home and deal with them themselves, but there was little chance that many of them could afford funerals, especially those who were burying multiple people. 7 families lost multiple family members. The owners of the bridge came forward and agreed to cover the costs of burying them, but rather than individual graves, they paid for 2 mass graves for 30 people each, where most of the dead were buried. Investigations into the disaster began the next day, with a coroner's inquest being held in a local church hall, with some interesting revelations discovered. Elizabeth Brown said there would have been plenty of time for everyone to escape after the first eye bar had broken, but she, like many, were unaware of the dangers. We can only assume she didn't hear the warnings being called, as it quickly became clear they had not all fallen on deaf ears. Among those who had listened was Eleanor Eliza Allman, who told the investigation that after hearing a man yelling a warning, she had run from the bridge about 5 minutes before it collapsed. Others had escaped by sheer luck. Robert Whitlock had left the bridge to fetch his brother and was about to step back on when it collapsed. And a Betsy Wright had just so happened to leave the bridge about a moment before the disaster. Soon, the British government commissioned a report into what had happened, led by the former president of the Institute of Civil Engineers, James Walker. His report brought up some damaging accusations towards the bridge's construction. Joseph Scholes had called for high-quality metal to be used in the construction, but hadn't specified any tests that should be done to prove this, and this had led to a mixture of quality of metals being used. The welding on the eye bars, the part of the bridge that had failed, were discovered to be imperfect, and had they been done correctly, it is very unlikely that the failure would have happened. The final part of the investigation drew much condemnation for the expansion work done to the bridge, as it increased the weight being supported by the bridge's chains rather than the main support of the bridge itself, by 2.7 tons. This, mixed with the extra weight of the crowd that was 3 times more people than the bridge had ever held at one time before, was a recipe for disaster. The Great Yarmouth collapse was not a unique event. A bridge in the town of Montrose in Scotland had suffered a very similar fate when people crowded on the bridge to watch a boat race, something that was noted in the report by another investigator, James Meadow Randall, leading him to describe such bridges as a mere toy, and believed that a traditional arch bridge would have been more than sufficient for what was wanted in Yarmouth. In the end, the report concluded that the main cause of failure was shoddy welding on the eye bars. Had they been tested, there is no way they would have been passed for use on the bridge. Blame was laid on the local surveyors and contractors. As the ones on the ground, they should have taken more responsibility for their actions. It was also put forward that in future, all public bridges should be inspected regularly to check for faults. The distress to the families was certainly not helped when a rather lurid letter was printed in several papers, both locally and nationally, that came to be known as the Warner's Letter. The chains on the Yarmouth side broke and let it down. Only that side, remember, while the other side still hung all right. You will have an exact remembrance by letting the leaf of a table down. Not a timber or bar of the bridge broke, but it shot us all into the water. There we were. The screams were horrible. They were heard for miles. To supernatural presence of mind and a strong arm I owe my escape. I felt an iron under me. I clung to it in a death grip, my mouth full of salt water, for the tide was up. I raised myself onto the bridge and got my head above the water. I clung up the iron and looked around me. Scarcely had I done so, I was not out of the water further than my chin. Then a man grasped me around the neck, his head just above the water. I felt myself going. I drew my arm back and struck him on the face. I hit him hard, for the skin is off my knuckles. A woman next seized me. I was forced to strike her. Her blood spurted from her nose all over her face and dimmed her eyes. I was the only one above the water, but the bridge gave another move. I was under. I rose again, but folks were under the water clinging to me. The case was now desperate. I felt in my pocket, and holding by one hand, I opened my knife with the other and cut all down my legs, but I could not make them let go. My knife and hand were covered in blood. A woman seized my waistcoat. She was young and rather handsome, a tradesman's daughter. I did not like to strike her, but necessity was imperative. I hit her, and she rolled over and drowned. Never shall I forget her look at me. It seemed to say, "You murdered me." I once more used my knife about a man, and jumped onto a boat and was pushed in, with two girls clinging to me, and got safely to shore. The presence of mind that supported me during this trial instantly deserted me, and I was carried to the next public house, drank some brandy, and walked home, my hands and face covered in blood. I went to bed and dreamt of it. I thought of the woman whom I last struck, came and reproached me for murdering her. As you can imagine, this published letter was met with shock, horror, and outrage, and soon calls were made for this man, or as he was also being referred to, something less than a man, to come forward and speak for his actions at the coroner's inquest. Great Yarmouth is not a very big place, and it did not take long for this culprit to be identified. Charles Warner's, a solicitor's clerk in the offices of Messrs. Fisher and Lucas. When questioned, he told he wrote this letter to his brother, and it was never meant to be published. As questioning went on, his story soon became more and more twisted. It became very clear that it was largely false, an over-active imagination mixed with the stress of the event, a nightmare, and several brandies. Warner's was forced to recant his statement of the events as fiction, and was let off the hook for his charges, something he should be thankful for, as had he stood by them, he was originally facing manslaughter, if not outright murder charges. Many of the victims were buried in St. Nicholas's churchyard in the town, with 7 others buried in the dissenters' burial ground. In the description below, you can find a link to the list of those who lost their lives in the tragedy, as well as where they were from in the town. But be warned, it makes for sobering reading. The bridge collapse holds the grim title of the largest loss of life in a single incident in Great Yarmouth's history, and along with the Tay Bridge disaster of 1879, is considered one of the worst bridge failures of the 19th century. It is commemorated with a blue plaque on the wall of the Swan Inn, one of the pubs that tended to the injured and stored the dead. It is located 100 yards from where the bridge once stood. A permanent memorial was erected on the 28th of September 2013 at the site of the former bridge on North Quay, consisting of a granite block shaped into a 1.4-metre high book that contains illustrations of what happened and bears the names of those who lost their lives that day. It cost £5,000, and the money was raised by local Julie staff, who said of it, "Finally, we're able to give people the respect they deserved." Her appeal gained support both locally and across the world, even from the descendants of those who had been involved in the collapse, and had it not been for her, it is highly likely that the tragedy would never have gained a proper monument. She also runs a Facebook page that commemorates the event. A link can be found in the description if you wish to join it. The disaster has also been covered in the book, The Fall of the Yarmouth Suspension Bridge, by Gareth H. Davies. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was the Great Yarmouth Suspension Bridge disaster, and this was a little bit of history.